I am Eric Parry, principal of Eric Parry Architects, the designers of One Undershaft. I'd like to begin briefly with a comparative cultural exercise of attitudes to tall buildings and urban habitat, with three cities, Paris, Frankfurt, and London. The origins of the landscape ideas that underpin the urban planning of Paris are here made clear by Lenotre's planning of Versailles, the gardens stretching to a kind of infinity of a horizon lowered in order that there isn't a kind of sense of reality disturbing that infinity. And it's something that finds direct echoes clearly in La Défense, the axiality that is set up in the same way through the grand vista and the alley of buildings around that axis. And that's very different from the case of Frankfurt, where the historic city was bound by the defensive walls and bastions, and for good historic reason, but it's then developed, taking those at the bottom left, into an expansion that has a series of alleys of large avenues that pass beyond the defenses, which are now gardens in the main. And you can see in the top left the rulebook of proximity that was part of the competition-winning design for the tall buildings along that. You can read that in the shadows that don't come to interrupt one another and form a very, very particular urban fabric. That's very different from London, where here you can see in this plan that is something like 11 weeks after the fire in 1666, produced by Wenceslas Holler, who had been working on the representation of London for a long period of time before this, but suddenly you can see the medieval street pattern laid bare after the fire. And that is sort of emphasized here in Langley's Faithful Guide of 1824, that actually has a series of radial lines. So it is in every direction from St. Paul's, and St. Paul's comes to dominate in a very particular way the attitude to where tall buildings can be created in any sort of direction from it and the conservation areas of the City of London. So running back 30 years, we have a disposition of tall buildings that are treated very carefully as eye catchers on the horizon, and that then develops into the more familiar sense of a cluster of taller buildings to the east of St. Paul's, and very carefully created to work around those views. And it forms a topography of high ground, peaks, lower hills. The idea being one that's derived in a way from the English picturesque tradition, which is illustrated here in one of Humphrey Repton's Red Books of 1812, a sort of before and after of a landscape tradition that sets up those vistas in an entirely different way to the axiality of the French model. And when one now finds oneself designing in the context of the Eastern Cluster, these are sketches from the competition for the Tower of One Undershaft, thinking about how it, as finding itself at the epicenter as a peak, the peak, becomes a very important part of that topography, clearly. Seen from the river as part of a landscape beyond St. Paul's. And indeed, when understood, for instance, here on the processional way, you can see how the valley that is described by the Leadenhall building and the Scalpel emerges to allow the dome and the lantern spool to remain intact against the horizon from particular views. So the site plan of Undershaft is shown as existing on the left. There is an existing modest tower there. From the site then is one where the tower forms a blockage. And the idea on the right of the proposal was to expand the scale of the tower, the new tower, to the points of the perimeter, and to produce, rather than a core as a spine of lifting, to pull the core away to the western side, in order to allow the very important set of new vistas between the medieval churches shown there and the undercroft to the Leadenhall, to create a very important expansion of the public realm and a sense of connectivity, of visual integration, as space syntax term it. And that in section is shown here, with the idea of the lobbies lifted above that horizon of the ground, which gives you an inverse, so that it exposes at the same sort of height the walls of the medieval buildings, and then develops a way of moving downwards to a territory at a lower court level. So this is the ground, opens up a north-south axis of 100 meters more. So very important to be able to set the expansion and the activation of that at the lower level. But at ground, the resultant is a huge increase in the porosity and permeability for the pedestrian, and access for cyclists into an undercroft below the court at the lower level. So this is ground, and that extensive vista that is opened up. And this is the lower court area, which is an open area that works very well with wind mitigation, and has around it the retail restaurants. And importantly, with the green, an entrance with the veils of security that gives direct access to the green lifts, the firefighting lifts, which actually take you to the very top of the building, which we'll come to. The lower concourse then is a place of conviviality, of meeting, and has, very importantly, below it the extensive area for bike storage, 1,700 places, and all the changing facilities, and to the upper side of the image, the servicing of the tower contained in a double basement there. So that gives you a greening, an intensification of the greening on the vertical plane, as well as the tree planting at the ground. Very important part of the proposal. And that expansion of the public realm in a decreasing capacity within the city becomes ever more vital. So this illustration shows a number of our projects. On Fenchurch Street, at the lower section, the built building here of Fen Court that strides over one of the north-south arteries, passageways, which is expanded and gives direct access to the 15th level, which is a pocket garden in the air with wonderful vistas around the city from that vantage point of a new horizon of accessible use for the public. And that has been added to with our recent planning permission for 50 Fenchurch Street. Here on at the centre of the image, the cascade of publicly accessible space is intensified by the 10th floor level on this proposal and the ground plane as well. So back to the undershaft and the sense that the rising through the building with its very familiar external bracing that rises, if one extrapolates the edges of the tower by a factor of 10, they join. So there's a very gentle entasis that invites one to the top of the building, and that top is given over to a cultural use, a civic use, rather than a corporate use. So we negotiated an agreement whereby the Museum of London would take these top 2 levels with 2 classrooms in the air and a museum capacity to tell the tale of the development and the future of the City of London, London and beyond. So it will be an amazing public offering at the top of the building, which is to be the tallest building in the eastern cluster. And we very much look forward to its development.